All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me now all the way to the back as well? Hands up. Good. All right, thank you. So this is the moment I think that Dan Pink said that it's going to go up again. So you're all hydrated and lots of caffeine. So hopefully you're ready for our research presentation. Thank you very much also for the award. It's an honor to be selected for this. Our paper, this is in collaboration with researchers at Harvard University, as well as our collaborators in New Mexico and Deloitte, without whom this would really not have been possible. So I'm Oliver Hauser. I'm a researcher at Harvard, and I work both on diversity and inclusion in organizations, as well as unethical behavior. And today I'm going to talk about combining data science and these people analytics tools with field experiments and causal evidence to try and see what works to reduce unethical behavior in the field. The traditional way we might think about when you have problems that have unethical behaviors associated with them is that you call these people that come to the rescue and run after the people that have done something wrong. And that's a great approach, but actually it also begs the question, why are we waiting this long? Why are we waiting until something bad has happened before we act and try to get them to stop doing this? Could we predict criminal or fraudulent behavior in advance and do something about it then? Here's a little bit of a thought piece to think about. There's a video, so if we can.
Look at me. Positive for Howard Marks. I'm placing you under arrest for future murder of Sarah Marks and Donald Beeman to take place today, April 22nd, at 0800 hours and 4 minutes.
So if you're not familiar with this particular movie, it's Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where they have these fancy, nice computer screens, as well as the ability to look into the future and predict who's likely to commit a crime and arrest them before they do so. Now, that's not actually the way we want to go. We don't actually plan on doing this particular thing. There's a few problems with this approach in general. And one of the ways that we might, Tom Cruise being one of them, the other problems that we might see is that it's maybe unethical. Is it really ethical to arrest somebody for future behavior that might not have happened at all yet? What about false positives? No matter how good our analytic strategies, our algorithms, what if we make even one mistake? Innocent lives might be harmed. And finally, there's very deterministic punishment. If something goes wrong, that person is immediately arrested. So we don't think this is the way to go. Besides the fancy name Minority Report, I think our approach is slightly better in that it combines methods that you are all familiar with, data science, and using and combining that with insights from behavioral science that we already know, and then try to figure out what works. So here's the approach we're taking. In the first stage, we're going to use some of these machine learning and behavioral targeting methods to pick out a population of interest, people who are very likely to behave unethically, and then target them and try to reduce unethical behavior in that group in particular. But we're not going to assume we know what works. To be perfectly honest, if somebody comes up to you tomorrow and says, I know exactly how to get rid of fraudulent or problematic behavior, they may be right and they're genius, but most of the time, there's just a few hints we have, but we don't know for sure until we have tested this. And the way we do this is using a randomized controlled trial or a field experiment, and also often called A/B testing in the online economy. And we assign people to control groups and treatment groups to really find out what works. The context that we're using for this is in New Mexico, the unemployment population, so people who have just lost their jobs perhaps, and they receive unemployment benefits. And at that point, they are cash, strapped for money, and they are looking to make sure that they have this income through unemployment benefits. However, one of the things that they have to disclose every week when they come in over a period of time is whether they worked last week. And if they did, then they have to disclose this. Not doing so and not reporting income you've earned intentionally is considered fraud. So what we're trying to do is we're using this two-step methodology to really figure out who are the people who actually ended up committing fraud, and then trying to use a field experiment to reduce that kind of behavior. In our phase 1, we have these machine learning algorithms, training data set, and so forth. And then in stage 2, we have a field experiment over a year and a bit more, actually, 2 sets of them, to really try and figure out which of our messages work to reduce unethical behavior. On the first phase, let's quickly talk about the things that you're familiar with, is random forest, trying to predict unethical behavior, defined in this case as actual fraudulent outcomes. So if you think about the authorities that go in and actually check, so human-led audits, to figure out was this unethical or not, was this fraudulent behavior, that's what we're predicting on with a number of different features. So things like your job, what industry you were in, but also something more transient, like your behavior that changes. The changes on the platform, what you click on, when you come online. And with that in mind, we want to make the most accurate predictions that we can to figure out when are you most likely to behave unethically. Our algorithm assigns a number to everybody every week when they come in. The number ranges from 1 to 100, and you can see here, right over on the right-hand side, on the x-axis, that's when our algorithm predicts that you're most likely to behave unethically. And then we compared it to the actual rate of fraud, and we find that our algorithm does pretty well, actually, in figuring out who are the most likely high-risk claimants that we find in the population versus the low-risk ones. We then focus on the high-risk claimants going forward in our field experiment. But let me just stop here for a moment and say something that's obvious, but it can save you millions once you figure that out, obviously. That alone can lead to a lot of efficiency gains once you know how to assign certain resources you have in your organization to do something more efficiently. The prediction is really good and is like one of the things to take away from this. But the second step is what we're doing next. We're using this targeting to figure out how, in the high-risk claimants population, to figure out how to reduce their likelihood of behaving unethically. So stage 2, phase 2 in our experiment, or our study, was the field experiment. And just to give you a sense for what this was like for the people that came into our studies, they were a part of this normally through the website. So they would have this question to answer, which if you blow it up a bit says, did you work during the reporting period listed above, which is the week prior? We want people to say yes when they worked, and we want them to say no when they didn't. But we don't want them to say no if they in fact actually worked. So how do we encourage people to say yes if they did actually work? This is where behavioral science comes to our rescue a bit, because there are a lot of things we already know about unethical behavior, and we can now test the ones that work best. So we have used these behavioral insight text box here, so you can see one example of that up there, to reduce unethical behavior. But we had a whole list of them, because we didn't go in thinking we know what's going to work for sure. In fact, we drew from a bunch of different papers in the literature to suggest what might be effective. The simplest thing you can do is simply reduce ambiguity and have a reminder message. Something else you might have heard of and it's become very popular are social norm messages. An example of this is 99 out of 100 people report honestly. The implication is, so should you. You don't want to be the one person that doesn't. I don't have enough time to tell you about all of the other ones, but I'm happy to tell you outside afterwards. So what happens here? We can see in a control group where they saw no message at all, we had about 5% of people disclose that they worked last week, which is the outcome we're interested in. Across the different treatments that we had a 2.3 percentage point increase, which is pretty big given the fact that this was just a message delivered at the right time to get people to behave honestly. We did, of course, find a lot of variation in the messages we used. Here's our control group again, and then here you can see the variety of messages that worked or didn't work so well. Again, underlying the importance of testing to make sure this actually has empirical evidence, has data behind it. Let's take a closer look at the one that did best, the social norm condition here. In the social norm condition, we actually had two different variants. One of them is particularly famous right now in the media, or has been used in the past. It says 9 out of 10 people report honestly. And the second one was one that dynamically pulled in the number from the county, which was usually around 99 or 98% out of 100 people reported honestly. Which one do you think did better? Well, it turns out it was the one that had a lot more social norm support behind it. Furthermore, we could figure out whether our timely interventions are really going to sustain this behavior change. So first of all, we can look at a control group where we did no intervention, and we can see over time, the more often you're considered high risk, so pretty likely that you're actually going to behave unethically, we found that that actually leads to less disclosure, more unethical behavior. But in our interventions, that goes away. In fact, it's a very sustained treatment effect. So what would I like to have you take away? A couple of things. One of them is we've been focusing very much on predictive analytics, this kind of data science that says what's likely going to happen. We think this is an amazing first stage, or first step, but it should be combined with trying to figure out how do we act upon those insights. And you can do that best by combining it with causal field experiments. Our example was acting before predicting who's likely to behave unethically and then deterring them with these nudges. We also think there's lessons to be learned around the kind of interventions that you're using. So a one-size-fits-all perspective, that one thing is going to work in the entire organization for all employees, for instance, is likely going to fail, at least for a subset of people. So instead, we think they should be adaptable and maybe personalized. And let me tell you quickly what we think this might look like. And some of you might already be doing this. I've been talking about first using predictive models and then running a field experiment where we randomly assign people. In this current work that we're doing, we're actually flipping it around. So this time, we're actually first running a field experiment, giving people randomly assigning them a treatment that we think is going to work, then using some predictive modeling to figure out what's optimal for you as an individual, and finally, we assign you to the optimal condition, and we also have a randomized control group as well to make sure we actually test this again effectively. So now we can really use your individual characteristics to figure out the kind of treatment that's most likely to work for you. What kind of implications can that have? Well, here's just a few of them, and I would love to talk to you about that more if you're interested in pursuing this. And we're looking for, as researchers, we're always looking for big organizations that have the sample size and the interest to do fascinating research to really drive this. Because as Tam Pink said actually beforehand, as we're the kind of researchers who do want to think one step further and make implications and try to encourage you to do this. So imagine the kind of personalized public policy implications this could have. At work, what kind of bonus structures you might want to be using. Different people care about different things. You can also see that in different health contexts where we might personalize treatments. And finally, in education, you might see benefits for that as well. I should say one last pitch here, which is diversity has come up as one of the major themes today, and I feel like that's exactly one of those other areas where we can use these kinds of approaches. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and thank you very much for your attention, and please find me afterwards if you have any questions.